Hi, I'm Mike Beliveau, and today's topic is going to be a look at the guns of the Fetterman fight. And no, I'm not talking about the recent Senate contest in Pennsylvania. I'm talking about the Fetterman Massacre, as it's usually called, which occurred in Red Cloud's War back in 1866. The Fetterman fight is really not that well known today. And it should be, because it was the second worst Army disaster at the hands of Indian warriors since the Custer Massacre. In fact, the Fetterman fight had been the worst until 10 years later. The Custer's Last Stand at the Little Bighorn kind of knocked it off of the podium and made it number 2. And, Custer's Last Stand has always stayed very prominent in the American psyche. And I think a large part of that is because of Custer's widow, Libby Custer, which Libby was fanatical about defending George Custer's reputation. And she wrote letters, and she made speeches, and she stayed very active anytime anything negative was mentioned about George to combat it. And of course, Fetterman didn't have that kind of advocacy, and to a large degree, the Army was pretty happy to forget about the Fetterman Massacre because Red Cloud's War itself was not a shining example of victory for the United States Army. In fact, Red Cloud's one of the few Native American chieftains to actually win a war against the United States Army. Though some could argue that he lost the peace. It wouldn't be the only time in history that that's happened. So what I want to do today is I want to give you some of the background of the Fetterman fight itself, put it in the context of Red Cloud's War and what was going on at the time, and let you know who the protagonists are. And then I want to talk about the weapons used during the fight, because it was a pretty interesting period in American history. Like I said, it was 1866. It was immediately following the Civil War. And it was a real transitional phase in the American arms industry and in the Army's use of weapons. Cartridges were coming in at the time. Repeaters for rifles were being developed. Some had been developed during the Civil War. So the times they were a-changing, as we say, and that had an impact on the Fetterman fight. And the speed at which those changes were occurring in the Army had, you might say, an adverse impact on the Fetterman fight. So let's step back a little ways to 1863, where all this started. So in 1863, gold was discovered in southwestern Montana. And the government was all in favor of exploiting those resources because the Civil War was ruinously expensive. Unfortunately, southwestern Montana was very difficult to get to. But a frontiersman named John Bozeman located a new route that cut about 300 miles off of the shortest previous route and went through much better resourced countryside. Plenty of water, plenty of game, plenty of grass. And that became the Bozeman Trail. So the government wanted to get a treaty with the Sioux to allow free access to travel on the Bozeman Trail. The Sioux, some of them anyway, particularly those under Red Cloud, were not interested in that at all. So that set up a problem. The government eventually got its treaty, and it got it because Fort Indians like Spotted Tail were willing to sign off, even though they know that most of the Sioux Nation would not. But the government got a signed treaty, and they sent Colonel Henry Carrington with the 18th Infantry to set up a series of forts 90 miles apart on the Bozeman Trail, 3 forts, to protect the travelers on the trail. The Indians realized that the regiment was coming in, the 18th Infantry, supported by a company of the 2nd Cavalry, and they were not happy, not even a little bit happy. So this was in 1866. They spent most of the summer and the fall, while Colonel Carrington was trying to get a fort built, harassing the detachments as they left the fort. And the biggest one, of course, was the Wood Party, because they were timbering about 4 miles away from the fort, and those timbers were being run to a steam-powered sawmill at the fort, and they were making palisades and making barracks and making officers' quarters and just making all kinds of things to try to get the place weather-tight before a Rocky Mountain winter hit in. So we have Red Cloud Sioux running a constant series of attacks on the horse herd, the cattle herd, the mule herd, the woodcutters. And these were rather small scale. At the same time, they were attacking people along the Bozeman Trail, which was certainly not good for anybody trying to get to the gold fields. Colonel Carrington's 18th Infantry would respond as best they could to these attacks. They would send detachments out of the fort to chase the Indians and sometimes recover some stock, sometimes not, sometimes get some bounty back, sometimes kill a couple of Indians. And this went on for months. And it seemed like this was just a low-level guerrilla warfare going on. But in point of fact, you've got Chief Red Cloud, who is no idiot. And what he was doing was learning how Carrington reacted to various situations when he was being attacked. And Red Cloud processed all this, and he decided that he could put together a battle plan that would kill a significant number of soldiers. And he was going to do that. Now, this is where we get to Capt Fetterman of Fetterman Massacre fame. Right, so Colonel Henry Carrington is running the 18th Infantry. He's the regimental commander. He's the one who founded the 18th Infantry. And the 18th Infantry was a top-notch fighting force during the Civil War. But unfortunately for Carrington, he was not fighting with it. He was always on detached duty away from the front lines, either working as a lawyer or as an architect, chasing down, Copperhead draft dodgers and prosecuting them or designing fortifications. But he was not at the front, and his men were. Captain Fetterman of Fetterman's Massacre fame was actually Lieutenant Colonel Fetterman during the war, and he was the practical commanding officer of the regiment taking them into combat. So you've got a situation where the colonel in charge of the Mountain Division and in charge of Fort Phil Kearny has never been in combat, though he's a senior officer. And almost every junior officer on staff is a decorated combat veteran, and many of the men are as well. And it's safe to say that the officer class did not care for Colonel Carrington, thinking that he was just a desk jockey. Now, Captain Fetterman was the previous commander, as lieutenant colonel, as I said, of the regiment, and he became the polar opposite of Carrington for the opposition to basically form around. So he was constantly on Carrington's butt to be more aggressive, chase the Indians farther, all that sort of stuff. So it looked like Red Cloud wasn't really doing a whole heck of a lot, but actually what he was doing is learning how Colonel Carrington fought and how he would react. And by mid-December, he was ready to put that knowledge to use. By that point, he had been calling for the tribes to assemble on his position, and he had about 2,000 warriors present in camp already from the Sioux, his tribe, the Ogallala Sioux, the Northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. And he was ready to launch his attack. And the person that he chose to handle one of the most difficult assignments, that of being head of the decoy company, was a young man whose name had been Curly, but as a result of a vision he had, he was now nicknamed Crazy Horse, and that's what he would be known as for the rest of his life. So, on the 21st of December, once again, a party attacked the woodcutters, and Carrington was going to respond with a very heavy response. He was sending 80 men out to chase the Indians and hopefully get a shot at them before they got into an area where he couldn't support his detachment, which was over Lodgetail Ridge. So he had pulled a group together, but Captain Fetterman showed up and demanded to lead the relief party as the senior officer president of the fort under Carrington. So Carrington allowed him to do that. So he suited up, grabbed his horse, went off. His friend Captain Brown went along, wanted to kill some Indians, thought he'd get maybe a dozen that day. Those were his words. So Fetterman, who had previously said, give me 80 men and I'll ride through the entire Sioux Nation, because he had very low level of respect for them as fighting men, because they weren't conventional. Now, on this day, Carrington issued unambiguous orders to Fetterman not to pursue the natives beyond Lodgetail Ridge. And unfortunately, Fetterman disobeyed those orders. Now, Fetterman left the fort with 80 men, mostly comprised of infantry, and with a few members of the cavalry, 2 well-to-do contractor-type civilians. So Captain Fetterman and his command disappears over Lodgetail Ridge. As they get far enough away from the fort, completely cut off. Suddenly, every blade of grass, every bush, every tree grows an Indian warrior behind it, and he's completely cut off. Between 1,000 and 2,000 Native American warriors fought in the Fetterman fight. Fetterman had about 80 personnel, most of which were armed with single-shot Civil War muskets. And he was wiped out to the man. Everyone died. And it was a great disaster for the Army, not to mention for Fetterman himself. As I've said, the worst disaster until the Little Bighorn with General Custer. So that's the background of the battle. So that's a quick background of the fight itself. So now let's take a look at the composition of the forces that met and the way they were armed. So there were 4 different forces that had personnel in that fight. One was the 18th Infantry. The 2nd Cavalry was next. Civilians working for the Quartermaster Corps were the 3rd group. And then the Native American opponents were the 4th. So let's start with the 18th Infantry. The 18th Infantry was primarily armed with a Civil War muzzleloading rifled musket. That was the Springfield Model 1861. It was the most widely used long arm in the Union Army. I think the British Enfield was the 2nd most widely used, but this was number 1. So the Springfield was a percussion cap ignition muzzleloader, had a 40-inch long barrel, it weighed 9 pounds, and it fired a 500 grain 58 caliber mini ball over 60 grains of black powder, 60 grains of musket powder. So that was an unwieldy weapon on horseback. But for weapons of its type, it was quite effective. The general effective range was 200 to 400 yards. But, given a fairly windless day, a good shot could definitely get out to 500 yards and beyond with the gun. The 1861 was aimed using flip-up leaf sights. There were 2 leaves, one for 300 yards, one for 500 yards, and with both leaves down, it was set for a range of 100 yards. Now, by 1866, when the Fetterman Massacre happened, the muzzleloading Springfield was already obsolete, and it was being replaced, as we spoke, by the 50-70 Springfield trapdoor rifle, which of course fired the 50-70, brass rifle cartridge. But the fact that troops around Phil Kearny had a slow-loading muzzleloader just added to their problems. And given that it had a 40-inch barrel, it was very difficult to use from horseback. So this was a pretty poor weapon to send out that area. Of course, we already discussed the lack of ammunition for the guns besides. So basically, Carrington had some problems with that 1861 Springfield. Now, the other major force involved in the Fetterman Massacre was Company C of the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. And when they arrived at Phil Kearny, they had a mixture of muzzle-loading Springfields and the newfangled Star Carbine. The Star Carbine was invented in January of 1858 by Ebenezer Starr, of Starr revolver fame. Same guy, Starr swords, Starr revolvers. He's the guy who made the Star Carbine. The Star Carbine was the 5th most popular carbine issued to Union forces, which means it was not very favored. And it fired cartridges very much like the Sharps cartridges, linen cartridges with a glued-in bullet and a thinner paper backing. And those are fairly robust. They handle almost as well as metallic cartridges. So that gun was not really a bad choice for the cavalry fighting the Indians, because at least it was a breech loader. It could be reloaded fairly quickly and you'd get more rounds downrange. As I said, when Company C arrived at Fort Phil Kearny, Carrington had the band exchange their Spencer carbines for whatever the cavalry was carrying at the time. And, of course, the band griped mightily about that, but Carrington knew what he was doing. I mean, he knew he needed guys out in the field with that firepower. Well, because the Spencer carbine was the cavalry's primary weapon, from the end of the Civil War until it was replaced by the trapdoor Springfield in 1873, it deserves a pretty thorough description here. So Spencer repeating carbines, or rifles, were lever-action firearms with a rolling block action, and they were invented by Christopher Spencer in 1860. This was the world's first military metallic cartridge repeating rifle, and over 200,000 of them were manufactured in the United States by the Spencer Repeating Company, the Spencer Repeating Rifle Company, and the Burnside Rifle Company. And they were made between 1860 and 1869, so they were still in production in 1866 when the Fetterman Massacre occurred. The Spencer carbine was adopted by the cavalry during the American Civil War, and it was also used in the post-war Indian Wars era, where it acquitted itself very well. And in fact, when it was replaced by the trapdoor carbine, this caused a lot of grumbling among cavalry officers, who recognized the utility of having a repeating arm for military purposes in the cavalry. And we got to admit that they were right. Okay, hey, let me interrupt right here, and just to let you know, I am aware that is an early 20th century McClellan saddle, not an 1860s saddle. And all I can say is, I couldn't get an 1860 saddle in time to photograph it with the gun, but I could get that saddle, which I picked up in an antique store. So, for the stitch counters, don't go hating on me on that. The Spencer rifle or carbine uses a rolling breech block that's mounted in a carrier. Firing forces are contained by the receiver at the rear of the breech block, and it's actuated by a loading lever that causes the breech block to roll out of battery. Once the breech block is clear of the the carrier rolls downward, and it ejects the spent cartridge, and it picks up a new cartridge from the magazine, which is located in the rifle's buttstock. Look, in this upcoming clip, I'm going to demonstrate how to load and fire a Spencer carbine. I'm going to be using the rifle version of it in this clip, but the procedure is exactly the same. Loading a Spencer is different than loading the Winchester or Marlin type lever actions that we're used to. The Spencer loads through a magazine here in the butt. And what you have to do is spin that magazine tube catch 90 degrees and pull the whole tube out. And then we're going to drop rounds right into the butt. We'll put them in nice and easy, and I'm going to put 5 of these 4440s in. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And now I'm going to take the magazine tube that we just pulled out, and we're going to reinsert it. Just push it right down, and then twist it to latch, and we're all loaded up. Spencer carbine was chambered for the 5650 Spencer rimfire cartridge, and that's actually almost as powerful as the 58 caliber rifled musket round used in the Springfield rifle. So good enough for them, good enough for me. Loading the Spencer is a problem because it's got to be loaded through the buttstock, which means that you've got to pull a tube completely out. The magazine on the Spencer held 7 rounds. Okay, so we've looked now at the 18th Infantry, at the 2nd U.S. Cavalry. So let's take a look at the civilians that were in the fight. By the time of the Fetterman fight, Carrington had enough civilians on hand to put together a trained cavalry regiment, if he should so desire, because they're almost all Civil War veterans who knew what they were about. But even though there are 150 or so civilians present at Fort Phil Kearny, there are only 2 of them who were involved in the Fetterman fight. And that's James Wheatley and Isaac Fisher. Now, both of them had been officers during the Civil War, so they certainly had some experience with being in a fight. Now, Wheatley and Fisher were armed with Henry repeating rifles. These were, of course, the precursors to the Winchester rifle. And they might have been the best armed people in the whole fight. I mean, they were firing, 14 44 rimfire cartridges every time they loaded the magazines up. And they did quite a bit of execution with those guns before they were overwhelmed. They knew that from all the cases, 5 cases piled up around them, and all the dead Indians and dead horses in front of them. So they acquitted themselves very well, but eventually they were overrun and killed. Now, they were using, as I said, Henry rifles, and we're all familiar, this is the precursor of the Winchester rifles. It fired a Henry rimfire cartridge. It loaded through the front of the tubular magazine, which was machined of a piece with the barrel. So now let's take a look at handguns used during the fight. Handguns used by both Army and civilian officers are really difficult to nail down. All the officers had handguns. And many of them were personally owned weapons. In fact, I think all of them were. Well, I shouldn't say that. All of them had personally owned weapons, but there were other handguns being used as well. For instance, Colonel Henry Carrington owned a 36 caliber Colt Navy 1851 Navy revolver. But he also had a pair of Colt 1860 revolvers. Now, handguns actually featured in most of the fights against the Indians around Fort Phil Kearny. And one of Carrington's reports read, Lieutenant Brown and a few men charged the Indians with revolvers, killing 5 Indians and wounding 16. So revolvers were still the cat's meow. Now, besides knowing that they carried revolvers, we also know that at least some of the officers wore 2 revolvers. And as one of the officers reported, this is going to be a quote, that evening, Captains Fetterman and Brown called unexpectedly upon the colonel in his headquarters. Brown was in a genial mood. He had slung his spurs casually in the buttonholes of his greatcoat, and he wore a pair of revolvers at his waist. So that's just plain smart, because remember, these are cap and ball paper cartridge guns. They take a while to reload. And I know I would feel better if I was reloading with a loaded gun right on the side of me, just in case it's exactly the time somebody wanted to take advantage of you. So that's the European ancestry folks of the fight. We're also going to talk briefly about the Native Americans. Now, at the Fetterman fight in 1866, very few Native Americans were armed with firearms. 10 years later, at the Custer fight, that was going to be quite different. But at the Fetterman fight, the primary weapon for the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors were bows and arrows. And it's been estimated that over 40,000 arrows were shot during the Fetterman fight. 40,000. This is a fight that only went on for about 45 minutes. So it's like 1,000 arrows a minute being shot. I mean, pretty amazing. And obviously pretty darn effective, especially against muzzle-loading weapons. So, due to the fact that most of the troops had single-shot muzzleloaders, they could not compete with the rapid-fire aspects of a bow and arrow. And many of them lost their lives because of that. Now, in addition to bows and arrows, Native American warriors also used lances, tomahawks, and war clubs. As I said, the only eyewitness to Fetterman's death was a Northern Cheyenne warrior named American Horse. And he contends that he killed Fetterman with a war club. And as I said, there's enough evidence that points to that potentially being true that I think we can't discount it. So the Fetterman fight was actually the turning point of Red Cloud's war, which doesn't mean it was over at that point. And in fact, there were a couple of major fights after the Fetterman fight. But the Fetterman fight so stunned the Army that their heart was out of that war at that point. And they would have been happy to take any face-saving way out of it. And that's basically just what happened. So, in 1868, the government agreed to abandon the Bozeman Trail forts and leave the road to the Sioux. Which, when they pulled out of the forts, the Indians promptly burned them to the ground. Well, that's a look at the weapons used by the participants on both sides in the Fetterman fight. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, thumbs up. You know what to do. Feel free to make a comment. I'd love to read them. And I'll be seeing you next week. Till then, bye.